Sego, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. It is a pleasure to be on the air in New York City and in Washington, D.C. on WBAI and WPFW. I have to remind people right off the bat that we are listener supported radio, and we count on your contributions to these stations to keep the stations on the air and, of course, to keep me on the air. When I get asked, and I do often, what can we do to help the native cause and whether, I talk about so many issues on the show. And my first answer is always going to be keep me on the air. I know that I'm offering a perspective, sometimes opinions, and I certainly know I'm offering facts that you're not going to hear anywhere else. So that's what I do, and that's why I ask that you support this station, these stations, I should say, and support Resistance Radio. Let me do the quick rundown on how you do that. You do that by calling 1-833-922-4692, and that's for WBAI. Or you can go to, or call, or you can also dial 1-833-WBAI NYC. And you can use your credit card or your checking account, and you can become a sustaining member. We call them BAI buddies. You can go online. You can go online by going to uh, buddy.wbai.org. That's buddy.wbai.org. You can go there and follow the prompts as well. And that's how you support WBAI, which is where I started this whole thing. And look, I give my props to Teokas and Ghost Horse for allowing me to stand in for him when he took a sabbatical all those many years ago, which led to me getting the opportunity to do my own show on WBAI. And of course, now I'm the only show. I'm the only native show on WBAI. I think I'm the only native show on WPFW as well. And honestly, I may be one of the only native radio talk shows in on the East Coast. And certainly, look, I get it. We're competing against podcasts. We're competing against any number of other types of media. Some more institutional than others. Some more mainstream than the others. I don't think I'm very mainstream. I think I'm a little bit out of the box, and you know, I don't think I'm the lunatic fringe by any means, but I think I am certainly out of the mainstream. If you're listening on WPFW in Washington D.C., you can go online there to WPFWFM.org, or you can dial 202-588-9739, or you can use the 1-800 number, which is 1-800-222-9739. And again, support the station, support this program. Even if you're listening to this show as a podcast, because I do put it up as a podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms. It should be available. Just look for Resistance Radio with John Kane podcast. You can ask your smart speaker, or you can go and watch this. I put it up as a video on my Facebook group pages, starting with Resistance Radio, and then I share it with a couple of others. And I do put it up on my YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. All right, I did all that promotion for all these other things. I'm not done yet. As many of you know, because I've talked about it over the last few weeks, I have been a part of producing. I'm an executive producer and the writer for a film that we are still in the process, early stages of rolling out, which is called The Long Hope. I know my friend Reggie Johnson came and watched the film. We will be screening this film next week at the Brooklyn Children's Museum. So I'm coming to New York. I'm going to sit in studio with Reggie Johnson. We're going to do a live program. Maybe we'll take some calls since I'll be right there in the studio. And I look forward to that. I don't get a chance to do that as often as I used to pre-COVID. So I'm going to do the show live in the WBAI studios, and then I'm going to go down to the Children's Museum in Brooklyn, and we're going to screen The Long Hope. All right, so what The Long Hope is basically a film that is almost a culmination of everything that I do on the show. I mean, everything that I do on the show. We jammed a lot in, and Reggie can back me up on this. We jammed a lot into 1 hour and 54 minutes. It wasn't easy. I didn't know how we were going to get it down there. And we had to leave a lot of stuff out, obviously. But I think what people will come away with on and watching this film is they're going to hear things they've never heard before, especially if they don't listen to my show on a weekly basis. But even if you do, you're going to hear different perspectives. Ross John, his son Ross Jr. I've got my friend Dego Rundage and Gunnar Zaraga in there. We have the film filled with what starts out as a little bit of a history about who we are. Then it gets into the systems of domination that the United States has imposed on Native people. Then we break it out into into a section about how we've resisted, including our fights over gaming and taxation, and trying to establish economies on our territories when the state and federal government are doing anything they can to stop us. So we cover all of that stuff. I even hit the residential schools and the mascot issue a little bit. But I think it's important that people get a chance to see these things put into context. Look, I concentrate on those legal doctrines that I think are illegal doctrines in a big way, but I bring them home. I explain how they've affected us directly, not just in a general sense. I mean, it's easy to talk about racism generally, but when you talk about legal doctrines that are so purely racist in their nature, and I mean not just racist elements within them, I mean the overall doctrines. I mean, the idea that our lands could be claimed because Christian nations of Europe laid their eyes upon them, and we were considered pagans and enemies of Christ, so they could just claim title to our land. That's an absurd proposition. And let me say this: for those of you who are watching me on watch the video of this, and I realize that my internet is a little shaky, so the video may not be great. But for those who are watching, I'm wearing my shirt that says the Doctrine of Discovery, and then I define it as per the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which says all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, and cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. I want to thank my buddy Ralph for sending me this shirt that I told him I wanted made up, and he gets it made up and sends it to me. So that's what we have here, and that's what the film concentrates on. But not when I say all doctrines, it's not just the doctrine of Christian discovery that's racist. The trust doctrine, where we're cast as wards of the federal government, the plenary powers doctrine, where they claim Congress has ultimate and exclusive authority to dictate all aspects of our lives, pass laws, enforce things, all of this stuff. These are absurd propositions, and they only exist for Native people. So in the film, what I do is I concentrate on how these slave era, pre-Civil War legal doctrines that were developed in the early Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall, how they exist, and they continue to exist. Look, the doctrine of Christian discovery was cited in 2005 by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Yeah, the liberal darling, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But it was also cited just last month, and then it was cited again this month. And the crazy part about how it was cited this month in a court case is there was some concern about the racist language of of some of these doctrines. And the crazy part is they address only specific areas of the ruling and not the overall ruling. Like the whole thing isn't overtly racist. I mean, it's kind of absurd. And I got to tell you, I bring these things up because there are people whose shoulders I continue to stand on. And I say that in my acknowledgement in the film. And I'm talking specifically about Stephen Newcomb and Peter DeRico. These guys, they do a podcast, and they're on Substack. If you want to search and stay current, there's no two people doing more contemporary investigation about the uses of these doctrines than Peter DeRico and Stephen Newcomb. These guys, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Stephen Newcomb coined the phrase, the doctrine of Christian discovery. He taught us all. We weren't aware of this thing. We were aware of the authoritarian rule that was imposed upon us, but we didn't know the origins of it until Stephen Newcomb did the deep dive, really fleshed it all out, everything from the papal bull origins of these things, for how it became law. He taught us about Johnson v. McIntosh, which is the court case in 1823 that codifies the doctrine of Christian discovery into U.S. law. And the crazy part is, I was just having a discussion with somebody. They were saying, well, what about colonialism in general? Well, let me be clear here. Colonialism was fully supported and promoted by the church. And it wasn't just colonialism, it was the spread of Christendom. Now, they may not have really verbalized this doctrine of Christian discovery. In fact, the Catholic Church repudiates it and claimed they had nothing to do with it, which is absurd all by itself. But the thing is, the founding fathers of the United States who fought for independence from the king, um, they didn't want anything to do with us. We were excluded from any of their Articles of Confederation, their Constitution. We're mentioned in their Constitution only to the extent to say we're not a part of it. I mean, and then we're mentioned right alongside foreign nations in places like the reference to the Treaty Clause and reference to the Commerce Clause. But we are not in any way, shape, or form considered by those founding fathers as a subjugated or conquered people. And it's not until decades later, in 1823, when Chief Justice John Marshall really wants to define land title issues. And he can't do it without really embracing how the church and how Europe were treating property law. So they didn't create property law in the United States. They borrowed. They borrowed from Europe, and they borrowed it from the church. And among those things was this notion that the Christian nations of Europe could go any place in the world where there were pagan Saracens or other enemies of Christ, claim our land title. They could take our possessions, and they could subject us to slavery. And that's from a papal bull. I mean, this first has its impact in West Africa before it even makes it across the Atlantic. And what most people don't realize is the first transatlantic slave ships were bringing native people from the Caribbean back to Spain, back to Europe. It wasn't bringing African slaves. That wouldn't come till later. When the colonizers, when the colonial, or the colonies, I should say, decided they needed free, cheap labor. They were already taking free, cheap land. Well, free. Well, I guess if you kill people for it, I don't know if it's completely free, but it's pretty free. And then they needed cheap labor, so they brought in indentured servants, and they brought in the slave trade. So that's how the United States is built. And the rest of the world has tried to compartmentalize that and put it in the past. The problem is you got countries like the United States and Canada that refuse to, because they have this irreconcilable problem. And that is that there was an original population, and yes, we're still here. We're still here. So the rest of the world, they make a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples back in 2007 before countries vote against it. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Why those four? Well, because they're still taking our lands, and they're still occupying lands. And the thing about Chief Justice John Marshall embedding and essentially codifying the doctrine of Christian discovery well after, decades after the U.S. Constitution, decades after the fight for independence, decades after all that. And decades after there's already been dozens of treaties that have been entered into by the United States acknowledging our land title. But he does this in 1823, and then over the next decade develops even more oppressive legal doctrines, the trust doctrine and the plenary powers doctrine. He does that to put nails essentially in our coffin, and essentially to justify, authorize, and for all intents and purposes promote genocide. Because that's what residential schools were. That's what the massacres were. That's what all of that stuff. The idea of herding us onto these postage stamp sized pieces of property in our ancestral homelands and other places, and then putting a fort right around us so they could monitor us with their military. I mean, when I hear all this stuff, this talk about no kings and we don't want the military in our communities. Well, welcome to our world, folks. What do you think they did to us? So Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, codifies the doctrine of Christian discovery into U.S. law, creates these other two legal doctrines, the trust doctrine and the plenary powers doctrine, but it doesn't take hold right away. Now, he's created this legal foundation between the 1820s and 1830s. It wouldn't be for another 40 years or less that they would actually pass a law that would now totally embed all of that stuff, not just in legal theory, but in legal practice. And that was the Appropriations Act of 1871. So in 1871, they declared that we were no longer independent sovereign nations, that Native peoples were no longer represented any aspect of independence. So they just declared it. There's no legal basis for it. They also, again, codify these legal doctrines, including the trust doctrine. They cast us as wards of the federal government officially now, not just in legal dicta from John Marshall. Now it's in the law. They expand and reiterate the plenary powers doctrine in law, and then they use this Appropriations Act of 1871 to expand the acquisition of native lands by using the pillars of the doctrine of Christian discovery. So, even though this stuff is developed as legal theory and legal frameworks in the 1820s and 1830s, it's not until 1870s that they've just nailed it. They've hammered it home. That's what they did. And so that's what we talk about in the film. That's what our film is intended to do, is to shed light, to explain this in ways you may have never heard it. Look, I invite any of you to read the books by Peter Dorico and Stephen Newcomb. Peter's book is called Federal Anti-Indian Law, and Stephen's is The Pagans in the Promised Land. And there are no two books that more clearly explain the legal doctrines, frankly, the hypocrisy of them, the fact that they are not founded or grounded in constitutional law, that they are based purely on their own domination code, their desire to dominate the lands and the peoples that were on it before they got here. It's all about domination. It's all about authoritarian rule, and we're still plagued by it today. Like I said, these things are cited, and they're treated as settled law. Again, in 1870, once they actually passed a law that codified it into U.S. law, then they decided from there on after they would treat all of these three legal doctrines as settled law, never challenging it. I say that, but the reality is there are a few people who have challenged it, or at least written different opinions about it. And of all people, and I talk about it in the film, I don't know if I mentioned Clarence Thomas, but Clarence Thomas is the first one. 20 years ago, he raised the issue about the constitutionality of the plenary powers doctrine. He said the court seems pretty schizophrenic as it relates to things like sovereignty. He doesn't understand how you can, on one hand, claim that we have possessed any aspects of sovereignty, and then on the other hand, say that the United States has this inherent or constitutional authority to regulate the metes and bounds of that sovereignty. He says it either exists or it doesn't. So this is what he said 20 years ago, right in the same time period that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was citing the doctrine of Christian discovery in an Oneida case. But more recently, Sam Alito has raised this question. Now, so he's joined Clarence Thomas in his query, or if not opposition, to this notion that the plenary powers doctrine is legal, let alone constitutional. Now, the problem that I have is that the liberal justices haven't said anything. We know what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, over 20 years ago, but Ketanji Brown Jackson, Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, they haven't said a word. In fact, they keep treating these things as settled law in the rulings. Now, granted, I want to be clear here. I don't think Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito, that their intentions are purely altruistic towards native sovereignty by any means. I don't know what their motivation is. I suspect it ain't good. But regardless, if they're raising some of these questions, even if their motivation is different than the liberal justices should have, my question is, where the hell are they? So part of what I'm hoping comes out of this film, because that's what I'm always asked. I'm asked, okay, you produce this film, you're trying to get native people and non-native people to see the film. What do we expect? Well, I'll tell you, on the native side, I'm trying to educate my people. I'm trying to educate my people to say, look, what they've been spoon-feeding you is untrue. It's kind of the same thing I'm saying to the non-native people. I'm saying, look, the stuff they've been spoon-feeding you about us, it's not true. There is no legal justification for claiming title to our land based on your Christian backgrounds. And that should be obvious, right? But there's also no legal justification for declaring that we're wards of the government. And to say that we're wards of the government because you showed up? Look, we've existed for tens of thousands of years on Turtle Island, on our homelands, quite competently, I might add. And we didn't just survive. We weren't a primitive people who were dying in droves every time the weather changed. No, we understood nature. We understood creation. We lived with nature and didn't try to defy it or challenge it in the way that white people have always trying to do with dams and everything else. I mean, with changing and polluting and doing everything else they do to the land, the water, and the air. No, we didn't do any of that. So we had thriving communities. And look, we actually went down some of the same paths that white people did. We built cities. They were unsustainable. So we bailed on them. So we did some of the same things that white people did. But then now I hear, I don't know, did anybody hear this? Reg, I don't know if you heard it. Did you hear J.D. Vance suggesting that child sacrifices were prevalent when the colonizers got here? That it was just a common practice for Native people to sacrifice, to murder their children to honor our primitive gods. That's an absurd proposition. It is such a stupid thing for any human being to say. Now, look, was there ever any indication of sacrifices that were done, especially in the Aztec and the Inca territory? Maybe. I don't know if that's as factual as what people like to claim it is, but certainly that's not a practice that we had as Haudenosaunee or as the people that the colonizers, came into contact with. That's just a made up lie. But see, this is the stuff we get spoken of as if we were just these primitive, barely surviving, a scattered population with no culture, no levels of sophistication. We had clearly defined languages. We had clearly defined governing systems. All the things that they try to claim that we weren't, we were. We just weren't like them. We just didn't believe in hierarchies. We believed in pure egalitarianism. We believed not just in sameness, but an equal distribution of responsibilities. We didn't all have the same responsibilities, but there was an equal distribution of it between men, women, the clans, all of that stuff that we had that was a part of our culture. And then look, I'm speaking in English, so when I say things like clans, I know people can shudder a little bit or whatever. If I say clan mothers or chiefs, those are not what we call them. It's what I have to say on the radio because that's the only way you're going to understand what I'm talking about. So, I mean, that's what this film is about. It's about teaching a little bit about who we are, then what we experienced, and then how we pushed back. So, next Thursday evening, we are showing the film at the Brooklyn Children's Museum. I'm so grateful that they're giving us the opportunity. I want to thank Melissa and Tatani and the other people who are helping us put this film on. If you look for the brochure, I've got it posted on my Facebook group page, both Resistance Radio and Let's Talk Native group pages on Facebook. Please look for it. There is a QR code if you want to register. I'm pretty sure you can probably show up, but I'm getting this word out, so I'm hoping we're going to fill a room. And I'll tell you right now, we haven't filled a room yet. We've had 50 or 60 or 70 people at a few of these events, but we haven't really filled a room yet. So we're trying to get this word out. This is what we're trying to do. I will say, not only are we doing this at the Brooklyn Children's Museum next Thursday, I'm also waiting on a confirmed date from the Maisels Documentary Center up in Harlem to do a screening up there. Our official premiere is actually in Los Angeles, just right near Hollywood. Our official premiere is in Los Angeles, and it's a part of the Red Nation International Film Festival. But I got to tell you, although I am really grateful that the Red Nation International Film Festival accepted our film into their festival, look, I don't have any illusions of grandeur about winning awards and that kind of stuff. If we do, that'd be great, but I'm not anticipating that because I got to tell you, this is the only film festival that has accepted us so far, and we applied to many. Some down in New York, yeah, you're a couple of New York film festivals. You guys, you just passed us by. Pittsburgh, Aspen, all of these places, and some of these were Native film festivals. Not all of them. Some of them were Native film festivals, and I think our messaging is a little too tough for them. I don't know if they want feel-good films or tearjerker films. Look, I loved Sugarcane as a film. It didn't make me sad. It made me angry. And that, too, got its jump start at the Red Nation International Film Festival. But that's one that pulls on heartstrings. I don't know that our film does that. Ours is really matter of fact. It's factual. It's an education piece. Does it make you sad? Yes, we do talk about residential schools. We talk about some of the the overt racism that our people have experienced as a part of the film. And will it make you a little angry? Will it make you a little sad? Maybe. But I'm hoping more than anything is that you understand the title of the film, The Long Hope. Knowing that we've been at this for a long time. We've maintained our hope for the future. And that hope is to assert ourselves as free people once again. Because the way we're being treated now, honestly, the way you're all being treated right now is not as free people. You got to fight for civil rights. Well, what exactly are civil rights? Let's talk about that word rights in general. Because there's a lot of different ways of looking at the word rights. I mean, there's human rights, there's civil rights, there's constitutional rights, and then there's the rights under what you would call the laws of nature. See, you can't change what the natural order of things does. I mean, look, you would assume that if nature created us, if we're created as a part of nature, then we all have a right to exist. First and foremost, we have a right to exist. But then you end up with this idea of sovereignty and authority and the power over people. So then you got to figure out, okay, what's the obligation of government? Do they have the obligation to fully secure and protect human rights? Well, not exactly. You only have to look at the United States and realize that human rights were the farthest thing that were protected in the U.S. Constitution. What they did was they laid down a certain level of civil rights, and they didn't even offer them. They just said the government will not infringe upon certain rights, like carrying a weapon or forcing religion on you. Although there was never really this true separation of church and state. The doctrine of Christian discovery pretty much establishes that wasn't true. But so when you look through at the civil rights movement, for instance, that was all about rights under the U.S. Constitution. So when the 14th Amendment got passed, did the formerly enslaved become free? Did they? Really? I don't think so. No, they became burdened and subjugated under the laws of the United States. They became U.S. citizens, and it was declared, it was imposed upon them. They were declared to be U.S. citizens. They weren't ever declared to be free. Now, they use words like free in the Constitution when they're counting people, but they still don't necessarily refer to free people as free within the sense of a human right. And I mention this because one of the things that became apparent in the making of this film and the studying of things like the doctrine of Christian discovery, when they claimed title to our lands just by virtue of being Christians, and that they laid their eyes on us and our land so they could claim not only our title, but they could actually try to equate conquest and discovery as the same thing. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. But when they do all that stuff, they're really imposing something upon a people. And they did it to everybody. They were imposing their Christian views and on people, even as they claimed that they would not, that there was some sort of separation. But there really wasn't. And so I think it's important that when you watch this film, you take away something you haven't heard. But see, what happens is when they talk about this discovery and the right to claim title to our lands, what Chief Justice John Marshall said was, of course, it's subject to the native people's right to occupancy. Well, what does that mean? What's the right of occupancy? There's nothing defined in law about that. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that talks about the right of the occupancy. So that's not a constitutional right. And it's not really a human right, because when they're talking about the right of occupancy, they're talking about the right of occupancy in the same way that we talk about the deer or the vegetation, the squirrels, the rabbits, the skunks, the porcupines. So they're acknowledging that there's a certain natural right. And among that natural right is the fact that this land already had life on it. So that right of occupancy is not a protected right. In fact, man has done everything they wanted to destroy vegetation, animals. They've driven certain animals into extinction or near extinction, including their much revered bald eagle. And of course, the buffalo. You know that mountain you've seen pictures online, that mountain of buffalo skulls. I mean, and those buffalo skulls were accumulated and collected because they were trying to kill the buffalo, destroy the buffalo to destroy us. This is like George Washington trying to burn all of our food stores, in the Sullivan campaigns. This was the next iteration of that. Well, let's destroy all the buffalo so Native people who rely on the buffalo, not just as a part of their culture and their diet and their food and all that stuff, but everything that the buffalo do to the land was something that sustained us. So if you destroy the buffalo, you can destroy Native people. So the point that I'm making here is those buffalo, yeah, they had a right of occupancy too. But the United States is not ever in a situation where they feel like the right of occupancy of anybody, whether we are somewhat human as they were regarding us, or whether we're, any part of the natural order of creation on this, in this hemisphere. The idea of man wiping out that right of occupancy was not only something that they did on a regular basis, but they actually, in a case involving the Tlingit. Now, the Tlingit are people who lived in many areas, but one of the areas that the Tlingit populated was the area known as Alaska. Now, for those who aren't familiar, because I have to remind people that Russia was just as guilty of this doctrine of Christian discovery as Europe was. Russia established a few outposts across the Bering Strait on the land that was regarded as Alaska. I mean small outposts. I don't even think it qualifies as colonization because it was hard to even assess that what they had established there were permanent, was any kind of permanent occupancy. But there were thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of native people who lived in that land. But Russia, by virtue of being Christian nations, or a Christian nation, asserted that outpost in Alaska entitled them to claim the vast territory of Alaska. And of course, what did they do? They sold it to the United States. So they sold this title to land that they had really no claim to. They merely had a small, really anemic presence in Alaska. And they sold the land out from underneath all the Tlingit. Well, one of the areas, a place that was referred to as Teton, at some point, at the same period of time that the Supreme Court was taking up the issue of racism in education, in Brown versus the Board of Education, that same court that could recognize racism when it came to educating black children was able to completely ignore any aspects of equity and fairness when it came to the Tlingit. Because the Tlingit were saying, you're taking all the trees off of our land. You've got white folks coming in and harvesting our lumber and paying us nothing for it. And that same court that ruled segregation and was illegal said to the Tlingit in Teton, we can just extinguish your right of occupancy and we don't have to pay you anything. You're entitled to no compensation for either having your right of occupancy or any of the resources taken from your land because it's not your land. We bought that land from Russia. Russia claimed that title through the doctrine of Christian discovery. And that's why you really have no status to raise the issue about compensation for resources taken from your lands. So let me reiterate where I was going in the first place. That right of occupancy is not a right. It's not a right acknowledged or protected in U.S. law. And frankly, it was that kind of right, those natural rights, those rights to any animal that was driven to extinction or driven out of an area, either through policy, law, or by any other means, there was never any protection. In fact, when we raise issues about things like the spotted owl being endangered, that's going to get passed right over because their right of occupancy is not really protected either. Yeah, they've got certain environmental laws about endangered species, but we were we were intentionally endangered as a species, as human beings, and there was never any attempt to mitigate that. And in fact, so much of American law still today rests on these legal doctrines. And that I got to bring it back to what I started talking about in the first place, our film. The long hope is our hope that when you watch the film, that you will not only become educated, that maybe you will get fired up a little bit as allies, because we know that we can't affect change without allyship. So we need the non-native population to understand the illegality of these legal doctrines and do something about it. Like I said, if Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas are questioning the plenary powers doctrine, how do we get to Ketanji Brown Jackson? How do we get to Elena Kagan? How do we get to Sonia Sotomayor? I think I saw her on the Stephen Colbert show the other day. So these guys have no problem being these public figures and enjoying their superstar status. Look at how Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to be known as the notorious RBG. Everybody loved Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Well, everybody but us not so much. And by the way, her citing of the doctrine of discovery and her ruling against the Oneidas in 2005, she expressed regret for that when she wrote her book. Yeah, so when she wrote a book which she profited from, she expressed regret on the ruling that she made and the opinion that she wrote there. You know what that means to us? Nothing. Because that ruling still stands. I was up in Akwesasne last week, and that's Mohawk territory up at the very top of the state. And we did 4 screenings of our film up there to various groups of people in Akwesasne. They are still reeling from some of their governments, and I say governments because Akwesasne is divided into the U.S. side and the Canadian side. And then on the U.S. side and Canadian side, there's also some traditional governance that's associated with the Longhouse. So you essentially have 3 or 4, depending on how you want to break it down, 3 or 4 different governing systems or groups of people or groupings of peoples based on who they acknowledge as their rightful government or whatever. And they began negotiating the settlement for land claims, and they put an incredible emphasis on it. And there was a lot of fear mongering, said, look, if we don't do it now, we're never going to get a chance. And they based that solely on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's ruling against the Oneida. And it was 8-1, so it's not just her ruling, but she wrote the opinion. They decided that they needed to settle this land claim in a rush and give away way more than they should have ever given away because they thought it's all they're going to get, and they had to get it now because of the City of Sherrill versus Oneida Nation from 2005, that ruling. So even without citing it in their land claims, they cited specifically that ruling. So this is how prevalent these ancient, and I say ancient by U.S. standards because you're talking about legal doctrines developed in the early 1800s that still plague us today. So that's what the film is about. I want the long view expressed, our long hope expressed, but I also want to educate our people to resist more and educate the non-native people to stand with us as we resist it. And you know what? Maybe when somebody gets an audience with, Sotomayor or Jackson or Kagan, the subject comes up. I would love somebody to ask them, how is it Thomas and Alito questioned plenary powers doctrine, but you guys haven't questioned it once? And what can we do to rectify that? Because I don't want to throw them under a bus because I want their help. I want those 3 liberal justices to stand with those 2 conservative justices. That's a majority right there. That's all we need to overturn some of this stuff. Regardless of the intent of Alito and Thomas or what their hidden agendas are, the fact that they're questioning this stuff should give Kagan, Jackson, and Sotomayor pause and should encourage them to question it too. Because I don't care what your intentions are. If you think protecting plenary powers is protecting us, you're wrong. It doesn't protect us. You know, that because that was part of the argument. They said, well, we need to be cast as wards of the federal government for our own protection. Because apparently we are being regarded as too incompetent and too vulnerable to who? Well, to your own governments, to your state governments, to your federal government. So you cast us as wards of the federal government to protect us? And then you pass all these laws that oppress us? Then you say Congress has our back? No, they don't. They don't have our backs. They never have had our backs. In fact, we were never even a part of your Constitution. So when your Congress declares that, that not only the formerly enslaved are citizens in the 1860s, and then in the 1920s declare that we're U.S. citizens, didn't we have a say in the matter? Look, I get it. The formerly enslaved probably didn't have a say in the matter. I mean, they were enslaved. So yes, becoming U.S. citizens was a step up for them. But I see no indication whatsoever that going from a free people on our homelands for thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and then suddenly being declared under the yoke of this U.S. Constitution in 1924, I don't see that as freedom. I'm sorry. And you only have to look at the world that you're living in now. For those of you who are saying, oh, yeah, Donald Trump is destroying the system of checks and balances. Is he really? Was there really a system of checks and balances? If that moron in the White House has been able to gut this stuff so easily, the question you got to ask is, did it ever exist? Did the separation of church and state ever really exist? Now that you've got Christian nationalism, just running rampant over everything? I'm sorry, folks. While you're fighting and protesting at your No Kings rally, I think you've got bigger problems than whether Donald Trump considers himself a king or not. Authoritarian rule has been the rule in the United States. And you only got to ask black people or Native people. What's your experience been? What is our historic experience been? And frankly, what is our current experience today? We lead in all the categories you don't want to lead in. Imprisonment, suicide, death by cop. That's not freedom. And this was going on before Trump. And you know what? It's going to go on after Trump. And yes, there is going to be an after Trump. I don't care how much people talk about him refusing to relinquish the presidency at the end of this term. I don't think he's going to live this term out. And I hope he doesn't. If that's a hateful thing to say, well, he's led a pretty affluent life, I think. So I mean, look, this is why I'm asking you to seek out. We do have a new website. It's gone live, although it's still a work in progress. It's called thelonghope.org. You can register to gain insight on when the next filming or what next screening is going to be. If you follow me on Facebook on my various pages, or if you follow me on YouTube, you will see the announcements. You will see the stuff on Instagram as well. You will see the announcements that I make about when we will be screening the film. And it is really important. Look, I realize I do the show every week, and I talk about some of these things on a regular basis. But I try to explain it in a way that perhaps I didn't reach you before. I'm hoping this film reaches people in a way that this show doesn't. Or that it interests people enough to say, let me tune this guy in. I heard something on that movie. I want to learn more. And you know what? Here's what I say. I say it about this radio show, and I say it about the film. Don't take our words for it. Do your own research. Verify that the things that I say in the film, the things that I say on this show, are true. Because that's been my experience. That some people will hear and think that, of course, look, you've got the maggots that are just always going to dismiss anything that doesn't conform to their ideology. I get that. But I think there are people that may be Republicans, they may be indifferent Democrats or libertarians or whatever the hell they are. I don't know. People within the political spectrum, and I'm talking about non-native people, that simply don't know. And so if I say something that you think, well, that can't be true. What do you mean residential schools existed into the 1970s in the US and the 1990s in Canada? You know what? Prove me wrong. I know that's an expression that somebody else was coining, but I've been saying this for years anyway, so regardless of that guy. I'm saying, yeah, prove me right. I'm saying do the research. Don't take my word for it. Look up the things that I say that maybe don't settle right with you. Because I'm not, I mean, if you find something that I've mischaracterized or misidentified or misspoke about, I want to know. I'm not adverse to being challenged. I want to be challenged. The whole idea of doing this film, in spite of the fact that it isn't being widely embraced, like I said, only one film festival accepted us. And I suspect there are people, not just in the legal profession, there are probably Native leadership. Although I don't really attack anybody in the film, I think there's probably Native leadership that's going to be made a little uncomfortable, because if they can't accept that the house of cards that was built, the framework that was built to oppress us, if that's really just a house of cards, what happens if it collapses? I mean, and of course, the immediate thing people think of, which is the cut of federal funding, I got to tell you, that's happening anyway, folks. But if that's what your concern is, then we need to change the dialogue. Because I'll say all day long, the United States doesn't owe us charity. They owe us debt and obligation, and probably reparations for the atrocities committed against our people, including the atrocities committed through residential schools, which is textbook definition genocide. Not cultural genocide, not paper genocide, genocide. That's what it is. So we have to hold the United States accountable for their illegal doctrines, for the illegal authority that they've expressed over us. Like I said, I don't think the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a panacea, but it's a start. I mean, the third affirmation calls these legal doctrines racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. That's what the rest of the world has said. Now, they haven't exactly stepped up to hold the United States, Canada, or any place else accountable. The other thing that is prescribed in here when it comes to issues impacting indigenous peoples, it calls for, as a requirement, free, prior, and informed consent. In everything from redress to environmental degradation that impacts us, to any of the state policies, and nation state policies, and I mean the United States in this case, or Canada, that have a negative impact on us, they say that they're essentially saying we should have veto power. Free, prior, and informed consent. And I'm going to tell you, when Deb Haaland issued her report on residential schools, we gave no free, prior, and informed consent. We didn't know what the hell was going to be in that report. And when I read what was in that report, I was appalled. So even issuing the report, which is as incomplete as anything could have been done, and of course it was done as she was heading out the door. There was no free, prior, and informed consent. We didn't agree with that report. I saw some Native people clapping their hands, saying, oh, Deb Haaland, she's really taking care of it. No, she isn't. No, she didn't. And neither the Democrats or the Republicans have ever stepped up. And then we get caught, then we get stuck playing their political battlefield, in their political battlefield. So now we've got a governor in the state of New York that literally has extorted billions of dollars. In her most recent attempt, extorted almost $600 million out of the Senecas. Turned around and gave it to a billionaire. Now she's complaining about SNAP benefits being upheld or withheld. But she did that to us, and we couldn't get Deb Haaland or the Biden administration to do a damn thing. So yeah, we have problems with Democrats as well as Republicans. I'll say it over and over again. The Republicans do not have a monopoly, not an exclusive monopoly anyway, on racism. We've seen it in governors in the state of New York, from Cuomo to Hochul, and prior. We can go all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt, who said that he does not agree that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but he suggests that 9 out of 10 are, and he wouldn't want to look too closely at the 10th. That's a paraphrasing, but that's a Teddy Roosevelt quote. Yeah, for all of you who have the Roosevelt rooms on your universities, yeah, maybe looking a little bit more closely at the white supremacy that guys like Teddy Roosevelt carried with them, or the white supremacy that guys like Abraham Lincoln, brandished on a regular basis. There's a lot that people don't understand. We don't cover it all in the film, but we cover a lot of it. So if you're available, I'm going to do my show with Reggie Johnson next week in the WBAI studios, and then I'm gonna and then I'm going down to the Brooklyn Children's Museum to screen this film. I'd love people to show up. Look, I'd love some people in the legal profession to show up. I really would, because I want there to be not just a social conversation, but perhaps a legal or political conversation about some of these things. That's my ask. If you're available, come. And if you're not available, then stay tuned. Follow me on my group pages. Again, our new website, which is longhope.org, thelonghope.org. You can register with us and give us information, and we'll notify you when and where we're going to do the next screenings. And we will be doing a bunch of them. I'm committed to this thing. I'm working with a few other people involved. I'm looking at trying to do one up in Mount Vernon. I'm working with the Urban Indigenous Collective. Hopefully, gonna collaborate with them to do a few of these events. So stay with me on this thing. Even if you can't make one screening or another screening, stay with us. And eventually, our plan ultimately is to put this up on a streaming service or put it up on the internet somehow so everybody can watch it. But the first thing that we want to do is we want to take it on the road, and that's what I'm doing. I'm taking it on the road now. My co-producers, Ross and Holly John, are going to go out to California for our premiere in Los Angeles. I'm sticking around this neck of the woods. So even though we're splitting up chores here and they're going out to California, yeah, I know that's the good gig, right? They're going out to California to the Red Nation International Film Festival. And you look them up, by the way. Red Nation International Film Festival. You can go through and you see the films listed. Ours is among them. And I think they're gonna stream our film during the film festival, which I think starts on the 10th and ends on the 16th. So it's about a week long. But they're going to go out there. I'm sticking around here in case there's the opportunity for me to do another screening in New York. I'm talking with some folks in Boston. I'm talking with some folks out in Connecticut. So I'm trying to take this on the road so I can not just show the film, but so I can talk to you about it. So come out next Thursday, 6:30 at the Brooklyn Children's Museum. And come meet me. Look, this isn't a money-making thing. We're not fundraising here. There's no charge for admission. This is what we're doing to educate people. So I'm not crossing any lines with this thing. Look, I have to encourage you again to support WBAI and WPFW. Go to their websites. Go to buddy.wbai.org. Go to buddy.wbai.org, and go to WPFWFM.org and support these stations, support this program. I'll love you a long time. All right, this is John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio, Yahweh. Thanks for listening.